But welcome to now our third workshop series in this series of developing research skills. I'm Gareth Jones. I'm the Assistant Director in the Office of Service Learning and Undergraduate Research. And we're super excited to be offering and collaborating with the Merit Scholars and two wonderful graduate students on presenting this kind of second tier of research skills. You know, you've got some research under your belt, but you want to learn more and get to some additional levels. So that's why we created this series, and so we're excited to be collaborating again with the wonderful Merit Scholars and with our wonderful grad students who are helping us on this one. So I'm going to go ahead now and hand over the time to Keegan and Haley, who will introduce our wonderful, amazing presenter who I've worked with and collaborated with for 2 or 3 years now. It's been a wonderful collaboration. So I know today is going to be amazing. So I'm going to go ahead and now hand the time over to Keegan and Haley to introduce Melissa.
Yeah, so I'll let Melissa give her whole spiel about credentials and all of that, but trust me, she's qualified and she's great. Haley and I are first-year PhD students, and we are happy to help you all with any questions you have. I'll put our emails in the chat. Send us an email about anything, and we'll either help you or find someone smarter or more experienced that can get you in touch with whatever you need. Take it away, Melissa.
All right, thanks, Keegan. It's great to have the chance to talk to you guys today. Everybody who's been able to attend, and those of you out in the YouTube universe in the future. So today we're going to talk about getting published and preparing for peer review. So hopefully at this point in your scientific career, you've at least had the chance to encounter scientific publications, and so you know kind of generally what they include, what they entail, but you probably haven't had much of an opportunity yet to really think about how would you get your own work that you've started doing at the lab bench, or really any other kind of research, whether you do research with human subjects or you're working at the wet lab. How would you actually get that information and that research that you're producing out into the world so that other people can see it? So that's what we're going to talk about today. But first, I'm going to give you a very brief introduction into who I am, just in case it happens to pique any of your interests and you want to reach out and communicate with me further. I figure this is great information for you to have. So I am a postdoctoral researcher at UAB. Essentially, I think of that as after the PhD, so I've completed my graduate degree, but before the faculty position kind of period in my scientific career. So my history is that I've moved around the country quite a bit. So I completed my Bachelor's of Science at Ohio University, so that's pictured up here. And after I completed my bachelor's, I actually went on and worked in academic science for a couple years as a research technician at Northeastern University. And while I was there, I was working with a microscopic organism called C. elegans. And I was studying how cells move and develop inside an organism. And then I went on and started a PhD program at Tufts University, which is also in the heart of Boston. So both Northeastern and Tufts are in Boston. And for my PhD, I moved into a slightly larger organism with an actual backbone, the zebrafish. And for that work, I was studying a rare bone disease called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. It's also known as stone man disease, if you've ever heard of it. And we had a really interesting and cool project trying to be the first lab to develop a zebrafish model of this rare genetic disease. So that was a really fulfilling project, but I realized as I was finishing things up that I missed working with my tiny little worms, C. elegans. So I moved down here to UAB for my postdoc 2.5 years ago. And I returned to working with my worms so that I could study sensory neuron function. And so that's what I do now. In general, I'm somebody who loves to use all kinds of model organisms. I work with worms predominantly now, but I've also used zebrafish currently and in the past, as well as fruit flies, mice, and even cell culture models. So I've tried my hand in a lot of things. I think that's a fun thing about being a scientist, is that you can really do a lot of different things if you want to. And so my research area involves studying how sensory neurons allow animals to detect and respond to the world around them. Really interested in kind of the cell shape, cell structure, and what's going on, the signaling inside of these sensory neurons that allows the whole organism to respond appropriately or inappropriately to things that they sense. On the side, I also am really interested in studying the best ways to teach biology. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and want to know how we can best make our classrooms places where students can be engaged, motivated, and successful. So that's my background. Now I'm going to go ahead and jump into today's topic, and I encourage you guys, if you have any questions or anything you want to add at any point, please feel free to either add them in the chat or just unmute and shout them out, and I'll stop and we can address those questions in real time during the talk. So I'm going to start with a question for you guys. What do you think it means to publish? Why should we even bother with publishing our scientific research?
If any undergrads want to cut me off, feel free, but I would say that publishing is the most important part of science, other than, of course, ensuring your data is good, because actually getting the data out there is how we can work at a global stage to actually collaborate on science and, you know, find good research results.
Yeah, I like that answer. Does anyone else have anything they want to add? All right, that's totally cool too. So that was a great foundational answer that Keegan gave. I'm going to give you just a couple of ideas, but this is not an exhaustive list of what it means to publish and why we should do this. So obviously we want to share results. And we want to share results with other scientists, but we also really want to make sure that we're sharing our results with the general public. We want to make sure that as many people as possible know about what we've found so that they can use that information. We also want to be able to build upon the knowledge of ourselves and others. So by sharing and publishing our results, other people can make further breakthroughs, and we can make science move along faster. Publishing also helps to establish your own reputation. So if you are somebody who starts to work in a field and you publish good science, people will get to know that you are somebody that can be trusted and somebody who knows what they're talking about. So it establishes your reputation. And finally, if you're somebody who's interested in actually establishing a scientific career long-term, publications can be a really important currency in your career advancement. So these are just a couple of examples of why we should publish and how it's useful. All right, so you've decided to publish. So what comes next? Well, there's a couple different things, and I'm going to go through them in order during this presentation. So actually, really the first thing you want to do before you get really involved in writing your paper is to choose a journal to figure out where you want it to be sent and who you want to be disseminating this information. And that's not actually a small decision. So once you've chosen a journal, then you want to think about what you can include and what you need to exclude. You want to decide how you're going to format the manuscript and learn about how to submit it. Once you've submitted your article, then it's going to go through the peer review process. And this is a process that is implemented for essentially almost any academic journal that you could possibly submit your article to. So it's definitely something you want to know about. And finally, we'll go over the revision and resubmission process if you get a review back from your peers that requires you to do some kind of revision of your original submission. So we'll start with choosing a journal. So every journal has two things that they look for in publication. They have scope and they have criteria. So your scope is going to refer to the type of research that the journal actually publishes. And I've included here, it's a little bit small and I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but I've included here the scope for a journal called PLOS Genetics, just as an example. And for this journal, they typically publish human studies as well as research on model organisms with topics that include gene discovery and function, all the way to chromosome biology and epigenetics. So the scope is really this place where you can go in a journal, and if you're interested in learning about the scope of a journal of interest to you, you can actually just Google the name of the journal that you're interested in and scope, and you should be able to find a page that has text like this for almost any journal you can think of. So especially if you're somebody who perhaps works in neuroscience and you think you might want to publish in a neuroscience journal, if there's papers that you've read that frequently come from a specific journal, you can try this out. Google the journal that you read a lot of papers from and scope and find out, is the work that you're doing right now something that falls within the scope of the journal you're interested in? The other thing that journals look for or have is criteria. And these are essentially the requirements for how you've done your research. And they typically fall along the lines of, are you being a good scientist? So this particular journal, PLOS Genetics, is looking for originality. They're looking for importance to researchers in the field. They want to make sure that there's interest to researchers in genetics and genomics specifically, so that's going to be a little bit more field specific. They want to see rigorous methodology, and that's really going to be the kind of criteria you see across the board for almost every journal. And finally, substantial evidence for conclusions that are drawn. And again, that should be something you see across the board. So you're going to look for the scope and criteria of the journals that you might be interested in. If you're somebody who doesn't feel like you're super familiar with a lot of journals in your field, a great thing to do at this point would just be to talk to colleagues in your lab space, colleagues in collaborating labs, or even your supervisor, to get an idea of journals that they may suggest that you could be interested in and look up more information about their scope and criteria. So another thing to consider when deciding on a journal is the impact factor. And this is an index that's calculated based on the yearly average number of citations of articles that are published in the journal. Now, historically, this impact factor has kind of been the gauge of how important papers are in the field. So if a journal has a high impact factor, it has been considered more important. And some of the journals that tend to have the highest impact factors in the field include things like Cell, Nature, and Science. These are some of the best heard of, most well-known journals out there. I see some chats. Let me open the chat. Thanks. Thanks, Gareth. Gareth's adding some suggestions for undergrad specific journals in the publications opportunities in the chat. So feel free to take a look at that as well. So I mentioned historically because one of the things that's been shifting in our fields in just the last maybe 5 or 10 years is that there's been more emphasis placed on the reputation, the positive reputation that field-specific journals have, even if they may have lower impact factors. So a lot of scientists are starting to recognize that as science becomes more, not divided, but like niche specific, because we have so many fields that people can be working in, that these field-specific journals are really good places for people to publish in. The impact just may not be as high because you're sending your work to a specific subset of people who are going to be most interested in reading it. So that's something to think about, again, when you're thinking about places to publish. If you have good work, but it's perhaps only going to be targeted towards a specific audience, then these field-specific journals can still be a really great place to publish your work, even if they have a lower impact factor. So we also wanted to talk about the different types of journals that are out there. And there's typically two different types. There's journals that follow a traditional model where the publication costs for getting the research out there are actually covered by readers through access tolls. And these include things like subscriptions, whether that be by an individual or actually by a library at a university. They could include site licenses or just pay-per-view charges. So if you've ever gone on the internet and just tried to look up a scientific paper that's in a traditional model journal, you may have discovered that they wanted you to pay like $40 just to look at one article. So that's what we're talking about when we say that there's a toll. And fortunately for everybody who's here, being a student at UAB, our library has subscription to a very large number of journals, so you should be able to get access through our library to a large and wide array of papers without having to pay for them yourself. But there is an alternative to this, and that's the open access model. And this model really came about and became really popular around the early 2000s. And basically how this model works is that the research, once it's published, is accessible by the public for free. So the costs are actually felt by the research team themselves. And there are some questions as to whether one is better than the other. As our science today in this country is paid for in large part by public funding through taxes, there is an argument to be made that the work that we do should be available to the public for free, since taxpayers already pay for it. But at the same time, publication costs being covered by a research team can get really expensive. So that's something that is really important to keep in mind, and to kind of do your due diligence about which of these models is more accessible to your own lab. If your lab has a lot of money, then maybe the open access model is something that your lab can afford. But if your lab does not have as much money available, then you may need to go with the traditional model, knowing that it may not be, your paper may not be as accessible to the general public. One of the other side benefits of publishing with the open access model is, in general, papers that have open access have higher readership because that barrier for being able to access and read the papers is eliminated. And they also tend to have a higher citation rate. So the last thing I wanted to bring up in talking about journals, and this is really a warning for you, and I think the earlier we can get this information out there, the better. There are predatory journals out there, and this is something that's really blown up in maybe just the last 5 or 10 years. But you want to watch out for this. So if you, as someone going through your scientific career, are ever contacted by a journal to submit a publication, check that they are a legitimate publisher first. as someone who's earlier in their career, you probably won't get a lot of these kinds of phishing emails. But as you go on further in your career, you'll start to see more of these pop up, especially if you participate in national or international conferences at some point in your career. The more you get your name out there and become more well known, the more you're going to get fishing expeditions like this. And they can be really dangerous. So check to make sure that places that are reaching out to you for publication are legitimate publishers. So predatory journals can do things like drain or steal money from you. They tend to charge really high rates for publication, and sometimes you will give them money and they will not even follow through in actually publishing your research. They also are a source of stolen data. So if you submit your information for publication at a predatory journal, there have been instances where these journals will take your data and they will sell it to other research groups for other research groups to be able to get publications. And finally, and unfortunately, because of the practices of these predatory journals, if you happen to send something to a predatory journal or work with a predatory journal, you run the risk of tarnishing your own reputation because of what can happen to your data and your publications. So just make sure to keep an eye out for that. When I started in the scientific field, this was not a thing. It's really becoming more and more of a problem just in the last 5 years. So it's definitely something to be more and more aware of as you move on in your career. All right, so now let's move on to, you're starting to prepare your manuscript, you've picked out your journal, you want to know what you need to include or exclude from your manuscript. And what I've included here, so going back to this journal that I showed you the scope and criteria for earlier, PLOS Genetics, what I love about this journal is that I think they have really, really clear guidelines for each aspect of submission process. So if you're ever looking for an example of guidelines, this is not a terrible place to start. But one of the things they've done is they've outlined the kind of organization that they want to see in a manuscript that gets submitted to their journal. So typically what they're looking for, you need to include a title. You want to make sure you have a comprehensive and accurate list of all of the affiliated authors and what universities they belong to or companies they belong to. You want to have an abstract, which is generally a summary of the work that you've accomplished and are going to describe in your manuscript. Some publishers will require an author summary. They'll give you more details on what this means, but this is essentially a shorter version of the abstract, which is why I say some do, most don't have this. Then you'll have an introduction, which gives readers a background into the work that you're going to be talking about. You'll have a results section, which goes into the meat of the research you actually did. Your discussion section, which talks about the impact of that work and maybe some future directions that your research might go in. A materials and methods section, and this section should definitely be viewed as incredibly important, especially in this day and age when we need to make sure that we're rigorous and our research can be reproducible. An acknowledgement section, your references for any of the work that you have cited in any of the other sections, but especially the introduction section. And finally, any supporting information. And that could be supplemental figures, could be supplemental information about materials, depends on what the journal asks for to put in a supplemental section. But I wanted to include this as an idea of what to include or exclude. And what's key here is when you're putting all of this together, you want to make sure that each of these elements ties together really well so that you're telling a story. So if you go through and you're trying to decide if there are results that you've gotten from your research as to whether you want to include them or exclude them, think about, as you're putting together the manuscript, whether it feels like those results fit into the story that you're trying to tell. So you've written your story. Now you want to make sure you have it in the right format so you can actually submit it for publication. Some journals have very strict requirements for submission. So for example, I've included here the requirements for the high impact journal Nature, just to give you an idea of what these kind of requirements could be. So some have page limits. For example, you cannot exceed more than 5 pages, and that includes your figures. They may have word limits where you can't exceed 2,500 words for your entire manuscript. They may even have figure limits where you can't have more than 4 figures of data within the manuscript itself. And finally, they may have reference limits where you cannot exceed more than 50 references. Now, article formatting is also something that's really quite strict and journal specific. So just like you would go and search for the scope of a journal and the criteria for publication in a journal, you really want to make sure to search for the formatting guidelines for the journal you've selected as well. And I do want to point out that a number of journals have started moving towards a format-free submission. This is a great, in my opinion, a great movement. Basically what they are saying is that write up your manuscript however you see fit, as long as you have all of the sections that the journal requires. Submit it. If it gets accepted, then you will work with the editorial team after acceptance to format for the way that the journal likes to publish their articles. This format-free submission is not likely to happen for any journals that have really strict requirements, such as Nature, as listed above. But for journals that don't have page limits or figure limits or word limits, I think a lot more journals are going to be moving in this format-free direction for the future. So that's something to look forward to. But for now, always make sure that you check your journal-specific formatting requirements before you submit. The last thing you want to do is do all the work to get your manuscript ready, work with your supervisor, send it in, and have it get rejected because of formatting requirements. So, speaking of sending your paper in and submitting it, that's where the process of peer review comes in. So, essentially, I've got this table here where the author submits their paper to the journal. If those journal requirements are met that I described earlier, then you move on to the editor of the journal deciding an initial evaluation of the paper. If the editor decides, usually at this point, if the content of the paper is outside of the scope of the journal, or it doesn't meet the criteria of the journal, the editor may reject the paper and send it straight back to the author. And this is usually a fairly fast process. But if the editor decides that the paper is worthy of consideration, then we move on to this process called peer review. And peer review is essentially the evaluation of work by one or more people with similar competencies as the producers of the work. So I bolded here in particular this part about people with similar competencies. And that's really the key. Those are the people that are considered your peers when we say peer review. So if you're someone who works in microbiology, then the people who review your publication will likely be other individuals who work in the field of microbiology. It's less likely that you're going to have somebody who works in ecology evaluating your work unless your work has a tie to ecology as well. So people with similar competencies is really the key there for peer review. They want to make sure they're bringing in people who are going to really well understand the work you've done and can evaluate it appropriately. So what kind of outcomes can you expect from peer review? Well, the first one, let's say that your peers agree to review the paper. They send their reviews back to the editor, and the editor is going to decide your next steps. The first possibility as an outcome from peer review is going to be that your paper is accepted. And this is a wonderful outcome to have. It's also, I don't want to say rare, but it's not as common as the other outcomes from peer review. Most commonly, what happens is the second outcome, which is that revisions are required. So what does that mean? Basically, that means that the peer reviewers read the paper, they thought that it had merit and should probably be published in the journal, but not before some corrections are made. And there's two kinds of revisions that will typically come back. The first is major revisions. And typically what a major revision entails is that the reviewers have asked for additional experiments to be done. For minor revisions, that's usually the reviewers have asked for additional written content or analyses to be added to the manuscript, but not entire experiments to be added, which would essentially add more figures to the paper. So there's one last outcome that can come out of peer review, and that's a rejection. And sometimes, as I mentioned on the previous slide, that can come straight from the editor if the paper is outside of the scope. Sometimes it will come from the reviewers. Typically, if the reviewers provide a rejection, it's an indication that they've found some flaws in either the data itself, the analysis of the data, or the overall conclusions of the paper that are bad enough flaws that they feel that the paper cannot be published in its current form. Some journals will send a rejection and send along a suggestion to send it to a lower impact factor journal. Others will just send along a rejection, and then you are free to move on to another journal to see if you can publish it elsewhere. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time, journals try to be fairly quick about sending along this information. So this can vary a lot, and this is another thing you can search for depending on the journal you're submitting to. But typically this process can take anywhere from, this peer review process can take anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months or more. So there's a really wide range there. There's a subset of journals, and if you're really on a time crunch, there are journals that advertise that they go a fast peer review process. So if that's something that you and your research team value, then you can specifically look for journals that guarantee that they will have a fast turnaround time from peer review. So let's take a look a little bit more at this revision section and talk about how you would tackle publication revisions. So my rule number one for any publication revisions is to read the comments the first time and then walk away from them. No one loves getting criticism, even if it is really helpful and justified criticism, constructive criticism, you might say. So the first time you submit a paper and you get comments on it, it might sting to read the comments. So this is where my rule is always to take it in and just let it stew before you do anything with these comments. Let your emotions die down a little bit, and you'll be better able to see the utility in the things that the reviewer suggested for you. Rule number 2, after you've had a chance to let your emotions subside, is to check how long you have for revisions. So typically, if a journal sends you back a decision that says you have minor revisions, they may only give you a month or 2 to get those revisions done, because they assume that any changes in analyses or writing shouldn't take too long. For major revisions, they may not give you a long time, but they may extend you additional time, maybe 3 months or 6 months, if you need to complete entire experiments. So if they ask for experiments, the things you need to do, you need to determine the feasibility of completing those kinds of experiments. Sometimes what reviewers ask for is not actually reasonable. And this is a conversation to have with your supervisor and your research team. If it's not reasonable, that's the kind of thing you put in a rebuttal to reviewers to say, while we see the merit of doing this sort of experiment, it's really outside of the scope of the work we do in the lab, and we just really can't accomplish this in the time the reviewers have asked for. An example of that would be, let's say, so I'm a C. elegans, I'm a worm researcher. If a reviewer came back and asked me to do some follow-up experiments in a mouse, that would not be a reasonable request for me because I don't work with mice. So to be able to do those kinds of experiments would be a really, really difficult task. So let's say you've determined the experiments they've asked for are feasible. The next thing you need to do is determine your timeline for how long is it actually going to take you to do those experiments. And if that timeline is longer than the amount of time that they've given you to do the revisions, you should ask the editor of the journal for more time as soon as possible. And that's only if you need more time. But if you contact the journal 3 days before your revisions are due to ask for more time, they may not be as willing to provide that time as they would be if you have done your homework up front, you've determined exactly how long it's going to take you to the experiments that have been asked for, or at least roughly how long it's going to take you. Then you can provide that information up front, have a justified reason to extend the timeline, and they're more likely to give you the time that you need. So let's say they've asked you for more writing. There's a couple of types of requests that you'll typically get from your reviewers. Oftentimes they'll have to do with clarification. Usually that's a helpful suggestion, so definitely try to include those sorts of things. Especially if they suggest anything that's going to strengthen your argument. For example, if they suggest that you mention other publications that support the argument that you're making, definitely try to include those sorts of suggestions. On the flip side, if a reviewer suggests something that's way off topic, it's not unheard of for reviewers to suggest that their own papers be included in other people's publications. If that's not a justified thing, work with your supervisor, but that sort of thing can be politely declined. And I really wanted to highlight here and mention, if during your scientific career you ever encounter anything that is wildly unprofessional or derogatory in the feedback you get from peer review, please make sure to contact the editor of the journal as soon as possible or ask your supervisor to do so. This is not okay. This is not the kind of behavior that we want to see in our communities. And the only way we're going to stamp it out is by bringing it up and making sure that people who do this sort of thing are not allowed to have peer review privileges anymore. So you don't need to put up with this, and You don't need to accept this as normal behavior in your community. All right, so you've decided what revisions you're going to do. You've managed to execute the changes in the writing. You've done some additional experiments. Your paper's looking great. You're ready to resubmit with your revisions. Now you need to include a cover letter with your revisions. And I've included a highlight of an example from one of my own cover letters. The more detail you can include in a cover letter, the better. So my personal approach, which has been really successful in the past, is to go through each individual reviewer comment one by one. So for example, number 2 here, I had a reviewer suggest that in figure 4G, I should mark the position of molecular weight markers. So that's a single comment. I addressed that comment concisely, but was very specific about how and where edits were made. And most importantly, I was respectful in every one of my comments to reviewers. So a cover letter talking about what you've done to revise your paper is not the place to try to get in a fight with a reviewer over whether you agree with them or not. You can decline to do things that reviewers argued that you should do, or especially in the case of experiments, you can say it's not feasible, but always maintain professionalism in these letters. The last thing that I wanted to add here is that it is totally normal if you have more than one round of revisions. So as we mentioned, from the outcomes of submitting a paper, it is possible to get an acceptance without any revisions. It's not super common, but it is possible. More than likely, you're going to have revisions. You could have one round of revisions and you're ready to go. You could have multiple rounds of revisions. Now, keep in mind, if you have multiple rounds of revisions and each round takes 2 to 6 months, this is where you can see that getting a paper published is not always a fast process. Each one of those rounds of revisions adds up. I can personally attest to having a paper take 2 years to get published. It can happen, but it takes a long time sometimes. That paper had, I think, 3 rounds of revisions, but it's out there now, so you can still be successful. All right, so once your publication is accepted, first and foremost, please celebrate your success. This is a huge accomplishment. You may think that there's millions of papers out there and that your paper is just a drop in the bucket, but what you're doing is really important. And you should celebrate every moment of success in your scientific career. So please do that. A couple other points that I wanted to add. You can always share a free PDF copy of your own publications with individuals if they contact you. And this goes both ways. So if you are a researcher early in your career who's encountering roadblocks with being able to access publications, like we talked about earlier, if you find a publication you really want to read and it has a pay-per-view and you don't have a way to access it, you can reach out to the authors of the publication, and more than often, they'll be really excited somebody wants to read their paper, and they would be more than happy to provide you with a free PDF copy. The only thing that they may not be allowed to do is freely post a free PDF on some of their personal websites, as that may violate the terms of the publisher that they published with. So that's where the second point comes into play. Some publishers may allow you to post PDFs on secondary sites. This could include something like your personal website, or if you get yourself a ResearchGate profile. Those are just a couple examples. If you're working with and publishing with an open access journal, more than likely you can post PDFs on a secondary site. If your journal is not open access, access, you need to make sure that their publication rules do not prohibit you from freely sharing PDFs of your own publications. If that's the case, then you need to go this route, where people can reach out to you and you can always share the PDF to individuals one at a time, because that's your own publication. So with that, I think that's my overview of getting published and the process of peer review. And I'd love to take any questions. I also am happy to have people contact me about what we talked about in the presentation today, or really anything else. If you're at all interested in C. elegans or sensory neuron function, or just want to chat about scientific research, here's my email. You are welcome to reach out to me and I'd be happy to hear from you. So yeah, any questions? And thank you so much for tuning in today.
Well, while we're waiting for maybe a question or two, I just want to thank you. That was great.
Oh, thanks.
Really informative. Just so wonderful. Yeah. I actually have a question.
Yeah, of course.
As well, too, maybe while the others are formulating a question or two. And this is one from and sadly I did not know the answer, so I'm going to ask you. So simultaneous submissions was the question. So if you were submitting to multiple journals at the same time, this student had some concerns about that, as you can imagine. That, you know, say you get into one that you don't want it in as much as you want it to get into another. What are some of the protocols, or kind of the how would you respond to that, you know, that sort of situation? Or
so I'm really glad that you brought that up, Gareth, because that is a great question, and I definitely forgot to include that in this presentation. As a general rule of thumb, simultaneous submission is a no-no. It is a do not do that. That is a poor behavior in academic publishing.
Good.
I cannot speak for every field, but I know that in STEM fields, that is not the way to do it. And if you read publishing guidelines and requirements for your journal that you're interested in, they may actually explicitly state that. But as a rule in STEM fields, you are supposed to submit to one journal at a time, which can be frustrating, because if you submit to a journal and the peer review process is taking a long time, you just have to wait. One way that you can try to deal with that if it's taking a particularly long time is you can work with your supervisor to reach out to the editor to get an update on the timeline. If you really feel like you cannot wait, you can retract your submission, especially if you've already communicated with the editor and you're not getting good communication back. You can retract your publication. But as a general rule of thumb, one journal at a time.
Excellent.
Don't send it to more than one. Make sure you pick one and wait to hear back before you try another.
I think that's a really, you know, a fantastic answer, but also, you know, it's such a great thing for undergrads, because undergrads feel a lot of pressure, right? You know, to hear, you know, they hear about getting published and they think, oh, wow, that's going to be my extra ticket to get into med school or to get into that great PhD program. And I feel like the same ethics and approach is true for undergraduate journals as well. He was asking, the student was asking specifically about undergraduate journals, but I think the same philosophy, it should be applied there as well. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think where it can be confusing is, you know, if you're an undergraduate and you might be looking at med schools or graduate programs, you want to be applying to more than one program. So that's a whole different scenario from publishing a paper. When it comes to publishing, you've got to go one at a time, because the thing is, if a journal agrees to publish your paper, then they have the rights to what you're publishing. So you don't want to put your data out there to like a million different publications, and then all of a sudden have all these publications have access to your data. That's your hard-earned information right there. So you want to make sure you're working one-on-one with a publisher to really feel like you're getting the best out of the experience.
Yeah, so it's not like submitting a book or our novel,
Yeah.
or trying to get people to compete over your material,
Yeah, no.
right?
No, it is not like that.
Good. I'm glad we talked about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions from our students? And if you don't have them, that's fine. We understand. But now's a good time if you do have one from Dr. LaBonty or Keegan and Haley or any of the Vistas if you have questions. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any pop up at this time. But again, I can't thank you enough for leading this discussion or this presentation, and for the Keegan and Haley to organize this. This is an extremely valuable workshop that I'm so excited to add to the others that we've offered, because I think undergrads are thinking more and more about getting published, and it's good to know these basic foundational things before you get too entrenched or too involved in it and make mistakes. This could save you a lot of heartache.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wish that I had exposure to something like this as an undergraduate, because I definitely didn't really figure out this process until I was probably well into graduate school, and it made it a little bit more complicated. So I
Yeah.
think that this is an excellent resource for undergraduates.
Right. All righty. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again to Dr. LaBonty, and we will be back next week.